Hey everyone, welcome to Source, the Rethink Mining podcast. I'm your host, Carl Weatherall. Today we're joined by Adriaan Davidse and Michael Raynor from Deloitte, where we're going to talk about a different way of looking at decarbonization of the mining industry through their initiative called Demand Better. Let's get into it.
So I've been a Deloitte lifer. I started Deloitte, I finished my MBA at the University of Western Ontario back in 19 and joined the firm for a couple of years as a straight in, get fed into the system. Did a couple of years and went back and did my doctorate at the Harvard Business School. And to my shock and amazement, I mean, you do a doctorate's a union card to go be a business school professor, and I ended up back at the firm, surprisingly, and have been there ever since. So that's almost 24 years now.
Awesome. And Adriaan, I understand you had a 28-year anniversary at Deloitte, so you're both lifers.
That's just the Canadian version. I started 5 years prior to that in South Africa. And so I had 5 years, joined Deloitte after I did my postdoc here at the University of Toronto at Braxton Associates, which was at the time a boutique strategy firm, a spin-off from BCG, Bain, and Braxton, and Deloitte acquired them. And then 5 years after that, moved to Canada and basically met Michael, I think, sort of in the first year or so, and spent the same time doing similar things.
Similar things being what? Like your focus areas?
More on the innovation side, I would say, than strategy. What I learned from Michael a long time ago, that is strategy is making plans within the constraints, and innovation is breaking those constraints. And it was always more interesting for me to try and break the constraints that we're sort of held captive to actually create new value.
Yeah.
So, so that was my attraction in the firm. And I originally planned to stay a year, and then after that, every year would be my last year. And I still have the same philosophy.
At some point, you'll be right.
At some point, you'll be right. Exactly.
Well, I meant we had a conversation 10 years ago when we first met about trying to convince a couple of people, let's go buy a mine and test technology and just run off and create our own venture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still think it's a good idea.
Oh, so do I. I was going to ask
But we didn't have
that.
money then, and now we have a means, I think, to access the funds to do that. And now there's also the urgency that somebody has to do that.
Yeah.
I remember, that was in the day with Jeff Emmelt at GE when he started the Internet of Things. He was the industrial internet guy.
Yeah.
And we were doing a lot of work, and they were doing lots of work in mining. And I asked him, I said, I don't understand. GE has all the components that is needed to create this new mine. Why aren't you doing it? And then basically his views were that we're all trapped in our vertical silos as well.
Yeah.
And unless somebody goes and built that mine so that we can all see how it looks like, nobody would do that by themselves from within. So,
A few people thought about it and tried, but it's just never happened yet. And some mining companies think they're doing it, but I can guarantee they're not.
Well, you can't fix the system from inside the system.
Yes, exactly.
And that's one of the many things that I took away from a long-term collaboration with Clay Christensen. So my work's been in, as Adriaan mentioned, strategy and innovation. A lot of the innovation work came out of working with Clay. I was a co-author with him on the Innovator Solution. And so I spent 20 plus years thinking about disruptive innovation. And what has amazed me is the utter lack of disruptive innovation in the context of, I will say, building a climate positive industrial society is something that disruptive innovation has been notable by its absence. And insofar as we're here to talk about mining, it seems to me it's utterly absent here as well. And what I would observe is that that's not a supply side failing. And that's something I think a lot of people miss, is that disruption theory is fundamentally a theory of customer dependence. You tell me whom you're selling to, and that's 98% of what you need to know in order to determine whether or not you're disruptive. So for example, it was the last piece I did with Clay. It was a Harvard Business Review article in 2014, I think, December of 2014 or 2015. Everything's a while ago now. It was, what is disruptive innovation? We talked about the fact that Tesla, for example, was not a disruptive innovator. And everybody's like, what do you mean it's not? Well, the reason Tesla's not disruptive is because whom did it sell its initial cars to? Well, it was selling them to initially, right, it was the Roadster on the old Lotus Elise chassis.
Yep.
And that was being sold to, guys my age with more money than I have who wanted a really cool car. And when the Model S came out, that was competing with high-end Mercedes and BMWs, right? Those are well-established markets. And Tesla came out with a better mousetrap for that particular segment of the market. And then they moved into the mainstream from there. So that's not disruption, right? Disruption is selling to a set of customers who want a fundamentally different value proposition.
Okay.
And I think in the case of mining, there is an inability to find there's no way to connect the production of metals to any customers other than the customers that already exist, who are beholden to the constraints that they face around volume and price and reliability and all the things that go with it. And so you're faced with the challenge of trying to figure out how to create a mine that delivers reliability, high quality, low carbon, low cost right now. Well, we don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
We don't know how to do that. And so the trick becomes, how do you create a market for metals that are first low carbon, and then you eventually learn your way into all of those other attributes. And so it's as a consequence of a fundamental market failure. I'm hardly the first person to suggest that the climate change problem is a problem of market failure, but it's a particular, in this instance, I think we can say more than that, right? We can describe it in greater detail, with greater resolution, and therein one hopes might lie the seeds of a solution.
Mm-hmm. So just to back up a little bit, Michael, you talked about disruptive innovation in the mining industry. Just to be very clear, when you say disruptive innovation with respect to the mining industry, can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, so disruptive innovation is a solution that shows up in a market that's outside of the mainstream, and it builds its own value system to deliver a fundamentally different value proposition. Right, so I know there's a lot of jargon in there, but what that captures then, right, are all the different attributes of a particular product or service. So if we're talking about metals, it's easy to think of them in terms of commodities, but what you learn when you look at any market is there's really no such thing as a commodity. Nothing's perfectly interchangeable. And so the attributes of a particular product, in this case a metal, will be, among other things, increasingly, thank goodness, its carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And so what is the carbon burden that comes with producing a ton of X, whatever that happens to be? And so what I tried to describe a moment ago, right, is that currently mines are producing those commodities, and carbon is frankly still an afterthought.
Yeah.
Right? If you can give it to me for the same or lower prices and it has lower carbon, sure, I'll take something for nothing. Who wouldn't?
Yeah.
But we all very often don't know how to do that, right?
Yeah.
So disruptions show up by first accepting a very different set of constraints, and then over time learning how to break them.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the key. And you look at any of the successful disruptions over time, and that is fundamentally the path they have chosen.
And that's what Adriaan was just talking about a moment ago, about innovation is breaking those constraints.
Yeah,
right?
But I think disruption is an unfortunate use of an English term that people equate to disturbing, perturbation. You've stirred the pot in a way that you've changed the balance, and suddenly, suddenly in the case of disruption, suddenly it's 20 years. Somebody shows up or some company shows up that's significantly more competitive, and the incumbents are unable to compete at the level of performance based on the dimension of performance that disruptors are focused on. But if you look at Tesla and others, I mean, they gained a competitive advantage doing something different, but it's not the technical disruption.
Yeah.
We like to use disruption, and I wish Clay could have chosen a different word because it's an English word that people associate with, somebody doing something different and pulling away and creating a competitive advantage, whereas disruption is a very particular way of doing that. And I think that definition is really important. And it would be hard for mining necessarily, I think, to do disruption. Just Michael's point, you got to go look for non-consuming customers or customers that's willing to pay a very low price, but do that in the context of needing to do environment, social, and governance in a different way, which layers more cost on. So it's counter to what you would say a low-cost disruptor would be able to do. What Michael will explain later is that the interesting thing is we may actually find non-consuming customers of mining commodities, which is, I think, the brilliant innovation Michael came up with, that actually will change the the conversation in how do we bring these mines. And now you can talk about disruption in the technical context, I think, of disruption.
Can you dive into, you just mentioned non-consuming disruptors. What
non-consuming customers.
Customers, sorry. What did you mean by non? Can you give it? I was just going to ask. Give us an example of what this would look like.
Yeah. So the one quick sidebar before I address that question directly, which is that I try very hard not to be a disruption bigot. It's not like that's the only way to innovate. Mm-hmm. So when I say Tesla's not a disruptor, that's not to take anything away from the fact that Tesla has revolutionized the auto industry, accelerated the adoption of EVs by a decade. Nothing's perfect. But there's a lot more good things to be said about Tesla, of what Tesla has accomplished than the contrary. Yeah. I would look at solar panels. They've gone through the same progression, not disruptive in the slightest in terms of the path they took to market presence and mainstream adoption. Nothing but good things to say about that as well. The opportunity, I think, in the case of mining particularly, is that folks have been metaphorically and I won't say literally, but it's the right metaphor, have been breaking their pick in the mining business, trying to figure out how to deliver low carbon, highly reliable, high volume, high quality metals, and we don't know how to, we can't fix that, right? Yeah. We can't Harry Potter, Star Trek our way into a solution. So and now to get to your question, what we've tried to think through is, well, if we can't do it via a frontal assault, the way we did it with solar panels and the way Tesla did it, where you throw enough capital at it for long enough that eventually it succumbs. Well, we can't figure that out. That doesn't seem to be working in the mining business. Yeah. So do we have have we got a different innovation golf club to bring to this particular tee shot? And the answer, I think, is yes, and I think my vote's disruption. Yeah. But that requires finding the right customer base. And what I would observe is that in the mining business in particular, and in a lot of commodity markets, collectively they're known in the carbon space as the hard-to-abate sectors, right? Steel, cement, mining, et cetera. Their direct customers purchase those commodities in such significant quantities that they form a huge proportion of their total cost base. Yeah. And so if somebody shows up and says, that 80% of your total cost base, I'd like to increase that by 20%. How's that work for you? Well, the answer is not so well, right? Nobody feels confident that they can pass along those higher costs in the form of higher prices. Yeah. So we have to find a way to connect the supply of these commodities to customers that might be willing to pay, but don't actually buy them. So therein lies what we hope is the insight that would allow us to create a new market structure that enables disruptive innovation. So you mentioned create the market where they buy but don't actually pay for them. Mm-hmm. Well, don't use them. Yeah, they don't buy them, but they use them. But they use them. So can you explain that a little bit? I hope so. So do I. So, everything in this room relies on metals at some point in its supply chain. But good luck finding it when it comes to actually identifying, what link in that global supply chain actually made a purchase on the London Metal Exchange for the nickel that's in the stand for the tripod. Yeah, yeah. Right? So the observation then is to say, well, wait a minute, we are consumers of mining commodities, but we didn't buy any of them. Yeah. But if somebody said to you, look, the value, right, the market value of all the metals, of all the things in this room is $25 at market exchange rates, given all the value add that goes into all of it. And Adrian's got some actual data as opposed to a hypothetical illustration here, but that's not crazy, right? There's tens of thousands of dollars of equipment in here, and there's not $100 of market value metals. So if somebody said to us, instead of $100 out of 10,000, what if it was $200 out of 10,000, but it was zero carbon metals? I don't know. That sounds like a deal I might take. Yeah. But then how do you connect that, right? How do you connect my willingness to pay for those commodities with the very far upstream commodities that are actually produced. That's the market failure, right? So the market failure is the inability to connect the consumer of the commodity with the producer of the commodity, because there are too many intermediate buyers, and so that's what we need to fix.
Now, is some of that breaking down a little bit now? If you take a look at the automotive manufacturers, for example, like you've got a couple of deals that have been done, sustainably sourced nickel, right? Who was it, GM or Ford struck a deal with Inco. There's others, Mercedes doing the same thing. So when you say that doesn't work with the market, are you talking to the market in general or regular consumers versus the higher end downstream consumers? And again, I'm just trying to rationalize those two things.
I mean, those are buyer consortiums trying by force to do the right thing because their customers are demanding it.
That's right.
But to Michael's point before.
So we're demanding up to the cars.
Yeah.
The car purchase, who's going to demand further up?
Right. I mean, eventually all of us are consumers of mining products.
Yeah.
We just don't understand how it's created.
Yeah.
We just see the bad side of mining,
Yeah.
the things that happen that we don't want to have happen. But mining don't have the capacity to do the things that society is demanding of it. And it's even, sort of another illustration would be if you added up all the market caps of all the mining companies listed in the world, it's less than $1 trillion, quite significantly less now. I mean, Apple was a $3 trillion company.
Yeah.
So one company is worth more because of the profit and the value that it provides to society. But mining is not seen by society in that light, right? Yeah. And so I think there's a significant underappreciation for the dependence that we have on mining.
Yeah.
And it goes further. We're very focused on doing the conversion to electric vehicles to reduce tailpipe emissions, which of course is where biggest emissions are. But what we're left with is converting from burning fuels to using metals to store the energy, to construct the systems that hold the energy, the metals in the car. So we're going from a fuel burning to a metal mining industry and really recycling energy through metals. But if we don't ensure that those metals are produced in a way that it is climate aligned in terms of the net zero goals, as Michael would say, we're digging a hole to fill a hole. And so I think the automotive industry is of course recognizing that. They're not oblivious to the fact that they're converting to higher metal content than maybe the internal combustion vehicles, and therefore have to make sure from a life cycle perspective that to get to true net zero, you have to decarbonize everything down upstream in the supply chain. And they're trying to do that with buyer consortiums. I'll let Michael expand on that. I mean, because of the dynamics that he's explaining, steel is such a huge input into their production. They can't afford to do a wholesale conversion to 100% green steel. So they will dabble in. We'll start with 10% and hope that doing the 10% will create enough investment potential for people upstream to start doing the things we need to do to drive the cost down. If there's no customers, there will be no learning curve. So, they understand that they need to do something. So that'd be their potential to start providing the oxygen, if you like, to do that. And then, but it's a very slow process because they have to do that at a very slow pace because of the massive impact that it will have on their bottom line. And so we need to do things significantly faster. If we do this on a trickle-down approach like this and hope to get to net zero by 2050, we'll end up with the mining industry would have grown in order to support the transition for the rest of the world, but we would have shifted the problem to mining.
Well, so exactly.
Mining has to lead this transition in some case because we're going to be depending on those metals.
You've got to inverse the relationship, the value relationship that you talked about before, but also who's driving the price.
Right.
It's not the downstream.
We got to decarbonize the things that we're going to rely on to decarbonize the rest of the things. Yeah. In advance.
And we kind of understand that, right? I mean, the shift to EVs has gone in tandem with an increasingly rapid greening of the production of the electricity. Yeah. Thank goodness for that, right? I mean, if you were busily shoveling coal into burners to generate the electricity to store it in batteries that were mined with diesel trucks, and all you did was stop burning gasoline in highly fuel efficient gasoline cars, I don't know that you fixed the problem. Nothing. So the good news is we kind of figured that out. More by good luck than good planning, but that's what's is happening with the grid, thank goodness. Yeah. As Adriaan points out, has to happen with mining as well. Now, the good news is that we can draw a second precedent from the greening of the grid with respect to, in some respect, how that has been supported. I won't say paid for because I don't want to overstate the impact, but it's certainly an important illustration of where I think an answer lies. So there's something called, it started out as renewable energy certificates, and then it turned into virtual power purchase agreements. The VPPAs, I think, are kind of the latest instantiation and are seen as more credible. So we'll focus on them for the moment. But what VPPAs do is they allow companies to essentially pay for green electricity, even though they use, I'll say, dirty electricity, and claim what's referred to in the carbon space as a Scope 2 net zero position. Scope 2 refers to the emissions generated in the production of electricity. Purchased energy more broadly, but for most companies, it's pretty much electricity. And so this focus on Scope 2 via VPPAs has been really quite effective. A lot of large companies spend real money, millions of dollars a year, purchasing VPPAs, and that serves to provide a clear demand signal to the generation sector, the electricity generation sector, that there is a market for green electricity. You should invest in those assets, and so that's what you see. Right? There's a lot more renewable energy capacity being added every year, certainly in the United States, than there is in coal and natural gas. I think this is close enough for this conversation in terms of the facts. I think now there's more renewable generation in the U.S. than there is coal. So that's a good news story in a space where there's not a lot of good news. And to some extent, again, I'm being cagey on purpose because I can't make a strong statement about the extent to which this actually funded it, but it is certainly a mechanism now that continues to support and accelerate the greening of the grid, right? So that's based on a separation, and this is critical, right? That's based on a separation between the commodities you pay for and the commodities you use, right? Because if you think about how an electrical grid works, you're generating, especially in the US, less so in Ontario, where we're recording this, Ontario's grid is something like 90% zero emission. But in other parts of the US, it's a very blended generation portfolio. They've got coal and natural gas and renewables and hydro and nuclear and all these different things. And so you can't track the electrons, right? So when you purchase your power from your electricity generator, from your utility, you don't know how it was generated. If you want to be a sport about it and you want to pay for renewable electricity, the carbon industry, the risk of overstating the case, has developed VPPAs over a 35-year period that has separated those two things, right? So these are financial instruments that companies purchase and trade and retire in a very sophisticated fashion, all premised on the fact that in order to support the green generation of important commodities, you don't have to actually use the green commodities that you have paid to have produced.
Got it.
And now that depends on one critical element, which is that you actually know that you consume electricity.
That's right,
and that you know how much electricity you consume. Well, in the case of electricity, that's easy. You get a bill every month. Here's how many kilowatt hours you purchased. Here's the price per kilowatt hour. Job done. Now I'm going to go back to how much nickel there is in this room. Good luck figuring that out. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are ways you can kind of guess at it that are probably, that I'll argue in a moment, are plenty good enough for what we want to do. But when we think about supply chains and we think about, so how much nickel is there really here? A lot of folks want to know the actual answer to that question. The only way you figure that out now is a destructive test and melt it all down and figure it out. And that's not...
It's not going to happen.
That doesn't work.
No.
So the electricity market provides a template for what I think we need to do for mining commodities in particular and for all hard-to-abate commodities in general.
So
and I would say there's a good example early on in Toronto, in Ontario as well, or Canada, Bullfrog Power, that did exactly what Michael said. It offered green premium. So if you wanted to say that you have decarbonized electricity, I mean, Deloitte would buy for their events, they would buy a block of power for that event from green power, from Bullfrog Power. That would then charge a premium of 20-30%. And that would then go to that would then lower effectively the cost of that otherwise more expensive electricity, so that it's dispatched by the system operator, knowing that the revenues will be there to make good on the use of that power. And so that was a market mechanism that people figured out early on. You need to do something like that in order to allow the people that want to make those investments to make those investments, which otherwise wouldn't have been made because there wouldn't be sufficient revenue to cover the higher investment they need to make in the earlier days, to
And do you
bring
see what that
green power
does?
to the market.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because what that does is it creates demand.
Yeah.
It creates customers. And when you think about most of the conversation that's taking place in the commodity space, hydrogen, mining, cement, what's everybody moaning about? They want cheap capital.
Yeah.
Right.
What? Cheap capital doesn't generate revenue.
Or government subsidies, that's cheap.
Yeah, or government
free
subsidies.
capital.
Yeah. So if my take would be that if we can create a market, if we can find customers willing to pay, and you can see that there's revenue at the other end of that investment cycle, the world doesn't lack for capital.
No,
There's
not at all.
lots of capital to invest in these things. What it lacks is a clear line of sight to the necessary revenue streams to justify the investment.
Yeah.
It's almost as though we're drowning and we think what we need is more water.
Yeah.
That seems a little upside down to me.
So on you talked, part of this conversation was on the VPPAs, scope 2 electrification, and previously we're talking about net zero in the mining industry and connecting the upstream and the downstream. So how could the principles of VPPAs apply
Easy
to
for you to say,
scope 3?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really technical
And challenging, too.
Yeah, so we're still figuring out how to explain this in a straight line.
Let me ask another question before we get into to put a bit of context to it, before we get down into the technical path, is as the mining industry is going down the pathway of net zero, there's scope 1, scope 2, they're spending most of their time on scope 1 and scope 2, and hard to abate industries as well. Is it fair to say that scope 3 is well understood and in hand, or there needs to be help, assistance, alternative approaches for scope 3s?
Yeah, so I'll back up just a step. So we defined scope 2 a minute ago, which is the carbon emitted in the generation of energy like electricity. Scope 1 is the carbon emitted through the operation of assets that an organization controls. That's stereotypically tailpipe emissions, right? Burning diesel fuel. It's emissions from things like chemical reactions when producing cement, for example.
Diesel trucks, whatever. Yeah.
And then scope 3 is that's an everything else bucket, right? It's the embodied carbon in all of the things that
get delivered to them.
At the risk of disappearing down a different rabbit hole, the two biggest buckets are typically what's known as purchased goods and services and capital expenditure. There are others, but for present purposes, let's just think about upstream scope 3, right? Which are the emissions embodied in the things you purchase, the assets you operate in order to run your business.
Yeah.
I think you have to add that there are downstream ones specifically for fuel companies, and we're ignoring it for the purpose.
Yeah,
of this
exactly. So
For
we're going to
simplicity.
focus so unfortunately, we got to do a little housekeeping, so that the with any luck, there'll be some real geeks on the other side of this broadcast who will want to know that we've tied our shoelaces with respect to the scope of the scope conversation. So fair enough. Upstream scope 3. And we're talking about purchased goods and services and capital expenditures. So what that means, for example, if you're a mine, you're driving a dump truck, it's the carbon that was emitted to generate the steel that became the dump truck. Right? The scope 1 is the diesel the dump truck burns. Fine. Okay, set that to one side. When any company is attempting to achieve a net zero position, it builds what's called a carbon inventory, and that carbon inventory is understood in these 3 categories, scopes 1, 2, and 3. For the vast majority of companies, the average for the U.S. economy is your footprint is about 10-15% scope 1, 10-15% scope 2, and about 70% scope 3. For hard to abate industries, quite different, much higher scope 1 footprints. Okay. So now the challenge becomes as a company. So let's just talk about, pick an industry at random. Management consulting for no good reason at all. A management consulting firm probably has a footprint that's 90% scope 3.
Yeah.
And so when it says, okay, I'm going to be net zero, it's got a problem on its hands because 90% of its footprint is out of its hands.
Yeah.
It depends entirely on all the things that it purchases and how those are created. So when it deals with scope 1, it can look at things like natural gas that it's purchasing to heat a building that it might operate. Yeah. Fair enough. When it looks at its scope 2, oh, that's easy. I'm just going to write a check and buy a VPPA, job done. And then it looks at scope 3 and goes, now what the hell do I do?
Yeah.
Because that's pretty tough. And so that's where so with that is kind of setting the table around the nature of the challenge that most organizations face when it comes to managing scope 3. The emissions inventory that these companies create is done using what's called an emission factor, right? A spend-based emission factor. There are other ways to do it. The vast majority of companies do it this way. They will look up an EF, an emission factor from somebody like the EPA, right? The Environmental Protection Agency in the US, and it will tell them, it will say things like, when you buy office furniture, the carbon footprint of office furniture, this isn't the actual number, but close enough to illustrate the point, the carbon footprint for office furniture is 1.2 kilos of carbon per dollar.
Okay. Per dollar of
office furniture.
Yeah. Of revenue from office furniture.
Yeah. So when you, at purchaser prices, so when you spend $1 on office furniture, every dollar you spend is 1.2 kilos of carbon. Yeah. Obviously, that's an economy-wide industry average. Yeah. It won't tell you specifically how much carbon is in this particular table that you're sitting at, but that's the way these inventories are built because there's no other way to do it.
It is better than nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's an excellent point, right? We want these measurements and we want these estimates to be good enough to motivate effective action.
Yes.
As long as they do that, we're happy, right? We don't need accuracy. We need effectiveness.
Yeah. So this is more or less right versus precisely wrong.
Yes. Yeah. So that gets you part of the way, right? So now we know kind of where that comes from. The interesting thing about those emission factors is that what is under that particular hood is a set of estimates about all of the upstream commodities that were required to create office furniture. Yeah. Right? So these are compiled in the US by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Every major economy builds its own input-output tables that generates similar estimates about all of the inputs required to generate any given output. So it will tell you that, if you're making office furniture, guess what? Here's how much nickel you need. Yeah. Here's how much, here's how much soybean oil you require. You read these tables and you're shocked at what goes in to make any particular thing you might be consuming. And so rather than then turn that into an emission factor, what I'm suggesting is simply leave it at the level of the commodity. And you can say, hey, look, in exactly the same way, and I do mean exactly, in exactly the same way you are saying, here's how much electricity I consume, I can now say, here's how much nickel I consume. Yeah. And in the
you're responsible for existing and using.
Yeah, you consume it. You buy precisely zero nickel.
But you're using it.
But you use... Yep. Right. So, with these tables, if you were again, to pick somebody at random, if you were a $30 billion consulting organization, you are responsible for the production of almost $10 million a year of nickel. Yeah. Well, now I can pull the same trick that I did with electricity. I can just do it for nickel. Yeah. I know how much electricity I buy. I can buy green electricity instead. I know how much nickel I'm responsible for. Well, I can cover the price premium required to produce $10 million of nickel at 10% the existing carbon footprint. Yeah. And then I get to claim that that portion of my scope 3 inventory has now been zeroed out. Yeah. And so it's, I've referred to this over the last several months as we've been building these models. It is, I think, a small insight, but it solves a big problem.
Absolutely.
Because it connects the end consumer, the end user, with the upstream producer and bypasses the incredibly complex, enormously financially constrained set of intermediaries and says, look, we don't need to worry about you. You guys run your business the way you run your business. I'm going to leap all of that, provide a price premium to someone who's willing to provide that quantity of nickel at a carbon footprint that I find acceptable. And then you just sell it into the market like always and sell it at market prices. I'm paying the premium. Nobody in the middle has to care. But making that happen requires, unfortunately, right? This is, again, we're back to you can't fix the system from within it.
Yes.
You fix that, you create this new market, and now we're back to what disruption in here is in.
Yeah.
If you're going to respond to that market demand, you need to create a completely different production function. Yeah. And that's something I defer to Adriaan's insight on what that needs to look like.
And you said create a new market. Is there already not that market emerging from, like young people who, for example, like way down in the value stream?
I just like
of demanding these sorts of things.
I just like to add to Michael's point, maybe to put it in different ways. So we're going to be allowing companies to keep two books: the actual stuff that they purchase and how it's sort of explained in their purchase agreement, and then the list of commodity that the combination of all of that translated into a list of definitive commodities from this input-output table represent. So you'd go to the CEO and say, here is your new purchasing order that you're responsible for existing in the economy every year, translated in terms of commodities. Nobody's ever seen that.
Yeah.
They see what they themselves consume in terms of energy that creates emissions. They see the electricity, and then they see stuff that they bought.
Yeah, like furniture.
Yeah, what Michael is not saying is like, this furniture and that tripod, they have nickel. So let's consolidate the nickel in all of your products, and let's do that in a structured way so that you can now say, oh my goodness, now I can see what commodities I'm responsible for. And then you can attach an emissions factor to what it takes to produce each one of those commodities.
But only a Scope 1 emissions factor.
Scope 1, yeah.
The only thing you care about are the actual emissions generated by the production of that commodity. So when you go to the nickel mine, you don't say, I need you to go buy zero carbon dump trucks.
Yeah.
You say, no. You go to the mine and you say, I need you to produce zero emissions nickel.
Yeah. However you do that is up to you.
Why? Because the steel that the mine consumes in order to generate the nickel shows up in my responsibility for upstream steel.
Yeah.
And so I will be paying to produce zero carbon steel in proportion to all of the other uses of steel in my entire supply chain. Yeah. And this is important because one of the things that it's easy to forget sometimes is Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions are an accounting convention.
Yeah.
The only actual emissions are Scope 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So if we got rid of all the Scope 1 emissions, there wouldn't be any Scope 2 or Scope 3 emissions, and that's a good thing, right? Yeah. So I'm not criticizing the double counting of carbon accounting. It's there because it's solving a different problem.
Yeah.
But the description, the solution, in scare quotes, that we're sketching here is one that connects, that turns consumers into buyers.
Yeah, exactly.
And to address your earlier observation, doesn't that market already exist?
Or starting.
Well, no, unfortunately. And the reason I say no sort of definitively is that folks can say all they want. Oh, I really want green nickel in my new TV, or better yet, I'd like green nickel in the steel that was in the truck that delivered. That demand is so dispersed and so distant and so far upstream and so inchoate that there's absolutely no way for that demand signal to coalesce and to become something that actually changes decision making on the London Metals Exchange. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And even if they had, to the point, even if they had the money, have the will, they understand the need, there's no mechanism to get it back. What they'll have to do is to pay their direct supplier, which they hope will pay their direct suppliers.
And I got a funny feeling everybody's going to want to take their piece of that margin all the way along the supply chain.
Yeah.
By the time it gets to the mining industry, again, there's nothing left. And so it's really, I in our earlier days, I thought a good analogy would be sort of the wormhole. We're creating a wormhole that connects the actually creation of this commodity at the hard-to-abate sector directly to the consumer that's responsible for that having to exist in the economy, and sort of basically bring time and space together with these two constituents. And to Michael's point, it's really important to understand that what we're doing is we're addressing a Scope 3 problem at the far downstream side of the economy. And that is used to address the Scope 1 problem at the far upstream side on the hard-to-abate sector. And the hard-to-abate commodities, I think, represent something like 60% of total global emissions.
Yeah.
So and it's hard to abate, not because the technology doesn't exist. I think we also create language that convince ourselves cognitively, therefore, that that's hard. We'll do that last. We'll do the easy stuff first, which is tailpipe emissions and stuff. We leave the hard stuff for last because that makes sense to start with the hard stuff. But it is hard not because the technology doesn't exist. It's hard because the economics doesn't make sense. Yeah. And the economic doesn't make sense because of the market failure that Michael explained. So you have to fix the market failure to actually say it's not that hard if somebody would pay for it, because you already know how to do it. The technology exists. And we're not talking about funding innovation in terms of you have a great idea, let's find customers to fund those ideas. That's what venture capital and angels are used for. We're sort of at the point where we're saying this technology is at TRL 8. It needs a substantial pilot and many of them to start driving the cost down to inspire wholesale adoption of that, right? The money doesn't exist for that at that scale because the investors that have that money to invest would not invest at that risk profile. Yeah. So we need to change the risk profile for the hard-to-abate sector to adopt those technologies by solving the market failure. So it's not hard. Yeah. It's hard because of the market failure. And this is the problem we're solving.
I think there's three pieces to that before I go back to the problem you're solving, what you said, Michael, about this is the models and this is what we've laid out to what's next. But back to the original start of the conversation and what you just said, Adriaan, is that part of the challenge within the hard debate sectors, mining being one of them, is also you can't solve it from within, because the challenges of how the industry does their business. Well, right.
That's a bit of a different problem.
Well, I know, but it's part of it. That's one piece of it. Then there's the market failure. Then,
but there's justification for them doing it the way they're doing it, because doing it differently involves risk. So it's not just the adoption or the availability of technologies. Then how do you integrate that technology in a mine design paradigm that has focused in a very specific way to reduce the cost? Because commodities are supply and demand, right? There seems to be very little differentiation value. We're now creating the opportunity that in a world that wants to decarbonize, the ones that could lead could command a green premium. Yeah. That now becomes a challenge for mining companies wanting to dip their toes into doing something different, because it requires them to sort of now guess, what would that premium be? Would that ever justify me doing the harder stuff? Because we have to go outside of our paradigm. When you start using renewable electricity, it doesn't show up in the way that coal-fired baseload power show up. So it's not just a question of plugging the technology in. You have to change part of the operations. You have to change your planning paradigm. You have to create more flexibility in your plans. Yep. That introduces a level of organizational process design risk that the mining companies really don't have the ability to accept because of the. Well, I don't think it's much will. I think it's that. I think Maynard Keynes, when he tried to change the budgetary process of the US, said the problem is not coming up with new ideas; it's escaping from the old ones. Yeah. Because we're reducing the risk by doing the familiar. We're now having to do something different that has some risk associated with it. So, but who's paying for that risk? The shareholders are not willing to do that because they're competing against commodity companies that wouldn't accept that risk. Except collectively, somebody has to accept the risk. Yeah. So we're trying to create the environment where we're saying, yes, the technology exists. There's still a lot that needs to be done to drive the cost down, but technically, it's at a point that it can be deployed. Financially, it's too expensive for the mining company to bear all that cost. And the risk of integration is something that we don't always talk about. And now the need to go and do something different where we haven't been trained because it's a new paradigm. All of that is associated with risk. But what if you can quantify that risk and say, listen, I'm not asking you to take any of those risks if it is associated with the thing that I want as the non-traditional customer, which says, I want to buy the dimension of performance that is, I want a mine that is at the level of ESG, and let's just focus on decarbonization for a second, but also all the other stuff. I want you to bring a mine to market that looks like that. You go and design that as your objective function and leave the finances out as being the driving constraint. And we'll understand afterwards what hole do we need to plug in order to fill that financial deficit, if you like, to give me the dimension of performance that I require, which is low carbon or zero carbon commodities. And then when you look at it in that way, I think people will have the ability to design that. But we start mine design with a financial constraint embedded in our heads.
Yeah.
And that causes us to make decisions which we have to make to be prudent in basically be able to have a sustainable going concern financial entity as a mining company. And that's very hard. So none of this will go with the flip of a switch. But if we don't have the important switch to flip, none of the other stuff can happen. And so...
And once you start relaxing those, once you've flipped it and said my objective function is minimizing carbon, then all of a sudden things like the size of the mine, the value of the ore body, all of the size of the ore body, all of these things now become variables that you can play with.
Yeah.
Right. So mining industry stuck in a paradigm. It's 17 years to light up a new mine in Canada. Why? Well, it's 17 years because you've got embedded assumptions about the size of the ore body, you got to sweat the assets, the capital density, all of a sudden. Yeah. What if you said, well, no, time out. The issue is 10% of the carbon footprint, and now it's going to be renewable electricity. To borrow the phrase, right? You fit the work to the power, not the power to the work. You do all of a sudden you're exploiting much smaller ore bodies, much higher quality for shorter periods of time that are lower capital intensity. And folks look at you like you're insane but that's not how the industry works, to which the only rational answer is, yeah, that's the problem.
Exactly.
And so to pick up on a thread you tugged on earlier, you mentioned some of the auto companies, for example, looking at ensuring supply. First of all, I think many of them are motivated, at the risk of claiming to read their minds. I think they're motivated about securing supply more than
sustainably sourced supply.
I'll soften it and say at least as much as they're worried about carbon footprint. So what we're describing here, a situation where companies like law firms and consulting firms can legitimately purchase a credible net zero status, and those are important modifiers, right? Yeah. Is that they become supplemental customers, right? So it's not or, it's and. And so if major consumers of these commodities are saying, look, I really want to take this seriously, and they're 40% of the required demand, well, let's go find the other 60.
Yeah.
And that becomes a negotiated process, like it always is with your suppliers, but it looks even better than it would under normal circumstances, right? So miners look at it and say, okay, I'm going to make a guess about what the market's going to be 20 years from now, and that's going to drive how I design the mine and the Really, what 20-year guess has anybody made that was even close to right, except for the fact that it'll be 20 years later? Other than that, you don't know. And so in the model we're describing, we're saying, hey, wait a minute. If I can build a demand consortium of companies that want to be net zero 40, what we can do with the models we've described is say, here's at a minimum the quantity of green nickel that you are prepared to subsidize, and all you have to do is show up in 2040 with the agreed upon quantity of green nickel, and it's an advanced purchase agreement. There's teeth in it, right? Yeah. So you've got auto companies, law firms, consulting firms, consumer products companies, banks, financial institutions of all different stripes, all showing up and say, yes, we're in this for real. No money up front, right? It's like a sale at the local furniture shop. No money down, no payments for 18 months. And when you show up in 2040 with those green commodities, we will then pay you the price premium that we agreed to. Yeah. What does that all look like? We'll have to figure it out the hard way. And to Adrian's point, it will be a bit of an iterative process. If it takes you 8 months and $1.5 million to design a mine, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
If you can think about it much more flexibly, and it costs you, $20,000 to do a 6-week iteration to come up with an estimate for what that will look, now you've got something to sell.
Yeah.
All the way back to where we started. You can't fix the system from inside the system.
Yeah.
But if we can find you customers who are willing to pay for this particular attribute,
that's the outside coming in.
Now frankly, I feel like we've removed the excuse.
Yeah.
We found you the customers. We know folks will pay. We know that they will pay for that commodity. How much? Don't know. That's to change the metaphor. That's your nickel up front. You're going to have to do some work to say, look, here's what I think I can sell, and now we'll have a grown-up conversation about who's willing to pay for what.
And I think the having the automotive companies involved, I think, is an important part. Let's say, who could be the lead initial customers or something like that.
Like an anchor tenant.
An anchor tenant,
And
yeah,
you
exactly.
probably need a couple.
Yeah,
Maybe.
but I say
Maybe.
like for a commodity, because I think that provides credibility that, okay, Volvo has vetted that the Swedish steel company is going to make green steel. So, they're just going to buy an insignificant volume in terms of what we need. But if that's the technology and that's the company, how about we then show up with other people that have more money to say, we now need to go back and actually redesign it to be much more substantial. But I think having those lead anchor tenants, if you like, involved in this new market mechanism provides the credibility that, maybe in the initial period, the rest of the market that don't have those skills and understanding lacks. So I think it's not either or. It's not the direct supply chain or this, to Michael's point. I think it's both. You need the credible value chain understanding, the technical understanding, and then you need to bring massive amounts of additional subsidies to help make this happen.
And back to the point I made about having more than one anchor tenant, because you're going to be looking at multiple
Competing
industries trying
technologies
to
maybe,
do that. Like use management consulting firm as an example, law houses, whatever, financial institutions. You get a couple of those so you can see the applicability of this across the entire market versus we're going to focus on automotive because they buy our steel. No. People see it.
Well, it turns everybody into a customer for everything.
Exactly.
And that's the point, right?
Yeah.
So instead of virtual power purchase agreements, VPPAs, it becomes virtual commodity purchase agreements.
Exactly.
VCPAs, God help me. It creates the market that is currently missing. And the numbers are not trivial. So there's a very specific example in the aviation fuel space. So it's an organization called SABA, the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. In fact, Deloitte is part of this organization. And we were one of the original founders, as I recall, sort of fewer than a dozen companies back in 2019, 2020. Now there are several hundred that are part of it. And these are companies that are that pay hard cash for the production of biojet fuel, which when it's burned is about 80% lower carbon than burning Jet A in commercial aircraft. Reasonable people can have different opinions about whether that's actually sufficiently lower carbon. I'm going to put that off to one side for the moment. It's an empirical question.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, and it's an important. Well, there's some people even disagree about that, but I'm not picking that fight, right? My point is that those are empirical questions. We need to get the right answers. But as a market structure, it's exactly the right idea.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it says to organizations like Deloitte, like law firms, folks that fly around a lot, look, you don't actually buy fuel, you buy airplane tickets. But in exactly the same way the power grid can't track the electrons, the airlines can't track the molecules, and they can't say to Deloitte, here, like, it just doesn't work. So they've separated the physical commodity from the environmental attributes of the commodity. And as a result, they are in the process of getting approved by the appropriate voluntary market standard setters a SAF-C, a Sustainable Aviation Fuel Certificate. And so this would be an attestation that you have paid for the abatement of a certain quantity of carbon, and you can declare that and retire it when it's approved against your declared Scope 3 inventory and have a credible lower Scope 3 footprint as a consequence of having abated upstream Scope 1.
Yeah.
Take a breath, right? I mean, this is always, it's 37 dominoes that have to tip over, but it works. And the cost per ton abated is pretty significant, right? It's in the hundreds of dollars a ton. Yeah. And so if somebody said to you, look, I'll give you $300 a ton on your copper if it's 10% the carbon footprint. Yeah. That's it, $300 a ton, free money. Well, not quite free. You got to earn it, but there's hard cash that companies have a demonstrated willingness to pay. Yeah. And so it's not as though it's total jazz hands here, right? I mean, we actually have existence proofs where these kinds of markets function. In the case of VPPAs, in the electricity case, they function very efficiently at very high volumes. I think the VPPA market in North America is predicted to be $30 billion by 2030. Very big deal. The willingness to pay these organizations is in the hundreds of dollars of ton per ton of carbon abated. When it comes to mining, I think it's like 80% Scope 1. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of tons to abate.
Yeah.
There's reason to think this could work. And so the missing pieces are the things we've just been describing, which is actual serious, hey, no kidding conversations about, we could produce this quantity at this carbon footprint over this time period. Who wants to buy it?
Yeah.
So having created the very real possibility of a viable demand side, now it falls to the supply side to see in that the possibility of creating a parallel system that operates outside of the existing mine planning, production, right? Because we know how to do this, right? Now we've created an environment in which disruptive innovation is now possible. And how to do that from an organizational perspective is a solved problem.
Yeah.
Right? There's no mystery here. Right? It's like losing weight. For the vast majority of people, you want to lose weight in a healthy, safe way, it's largely a function of eating less and exercising more. The reason we keep asking the questions is because we don't like the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there is a way to do this. And so my hope is that that now there's an opportunity to engage in some serious conversations on the supply side to take advantage of this nascent demand.
And sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's maybe a good point to talk about, the evolution of how disruptive innovation looks like. So this is the sort of the foothold market that we're creating with non-traditional customers.
Yeah.
So you're creating this new mine that is selling into the normal commodity market at normal commodity prices, but there's this environmental attribute that indirect customers are purchasing. So you're actually, you're splitting your customers, so you're solving a problem for non-traditional customers. But do you now have to do that forever, and do you forever be reliant on this market mechanism? That's not necessarily how disruptive innovation works, right? So this non-traditional customer allow you to do the learning that you need to do to become more competitive, to eventually compete with the mainstream market. Yeah. Which in disruptive innovation is the upmarket march, I guess, right? So here we're marching upmarket by lowering the cost through the learning that is provided by doing stuff from the funding that we get from non-traditional customers. So the idea would be that 20 years from now, the companies that have started down this track with this non-traditional market funding mechanism will have learned so much, and the technology would have proved so much working with their suppliers, that it is now lower cost, but retains the environmental attributes and the dimension of performance that we really care about, which is zero emissions.
Yeah.
And so now the incumbents that didn't do this innovation, that stuck with the normal route, will now become uncompetitive in a market that may have now paid more green premiums. But even in a market with no green premiums, you will now have suppliers showing up at the London Metals Exchange with attributes that the world needs and desires without the additional cost. And at that point, maybe we figured out carbon tax. So the people that buy normally from the commodity suppliers will have to now pay those carbon taxes. So you understand that the market at that point, specifically the automotive companies and the large buyers, will say, I am not buying from a dirty supplier, dirty as in terms of carbon, and then have to be responsible for the carbon tax when I can buy from a company that has zero emissions metals, even at no premium. So this really fits the classic disruption theory that we start at the foothold market.
That's an excellent point. I wouldn't want anyone to walk away with the view that somehow this is the forever solution, that you're constantly selling environmental attributes upstream to forever and ever. Yeah. I don't think that. I mean, in theory, it could work. As a practical matter, I don't think it's sustainable. I think the VPPA market will ultimately disappear because it'll all be green electricity.
You won't need it anymore.
And that's not a failure. That's what success looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so similarly, I would see these advanced purchase agreements for these virtual commodity advanced purchase agreements. They would come with a timestamp on them.
Yeah.
Right. It would start when you light up the mine in 2036, and it turns off 5 years later.
Yeah.
And so for those 5 years, on the demand side, it means that the companies that are purchasing those environmental attributes will be the only organizations anywhere who are credibly net zero.
Yeah.
Because everybody else, PS, is stuck with an emission factor that is attached to industry average emissions, which won't be 90% decarbonized. Yeah. So everybody else is going to be stuck with dealing with their own scope 1 and 2, wringing their hands over the classic scope 3 problem that they won't be able to fix. So if there are 2,000, 3,000, large global companies that sign up on the demand side for this, they will be the only ones who get to take a bow and say, hey, no kidding, for real, we are net zero. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, we provided the activation energy is the phrase that Adriaan coined. We've provided the activation energy to put the entire industry on the path to global net zero. Because the thing about net zero as a competitive advantage among companies like consumer products organizations is that net zero is only worth achieving if everybody else also gets there, right? So you can't think of it as winning the race. You have to think of it as showing the way. Yeah. And if you get there first and you enjoy a 5-6 year lead time advantage where you're able to bask legitimately, right, in the halo of good that you've done, that's great. That's you will have earned it. You will have paid for it. And then when everybody else catches up, that will have been your doing too.
That's right.
And so I think
which is essentially what Elon Musk did with Tesla, right?
Yeah. And you'll be moving on to the next.
It's not able for one company to decarbonize the economy, but it's possible for them to show the way.
Exactly.
And to show the way, such a and in the first 10 years, people ostracized them. It's like, well, yeah, it's not going to work. This is not going to work. Yes, because it's not a point solution. He needed to build the ecosystem, and it wasn't visible for people until it was done. Yeah. And then they went,
well, that works. I like that.
Yeah, that works. Everybody wants it, and we're now behind. And so now it's catalyzed the rest of the industry to change. So much so that the governments have now said, well, he's shown that it is possible, and we now are going to put legislation and regulation in place that you're not allowed to sell or manufacture these cars anymore. I mean, that's as clear a strategy signal for anybody to say, I know what my strategy is. I need to follow this path. Otherwise, there's no path to follow. Yeah. And so what is the analogy that we can create for the upstream commodities, which is not so clear for people, which is what we're trying to do now, and saying, do exactly that. So, and if we don't, and the point is, if we do not do this now, it doesn't help for us to start doing this 20, 30 years from now.
It's too late.
Because mining in certain areas, specifically lithium and others, are going to have to scale in order to support this transition. We want them to bring those plans forward that allow them to scale in the way that is aligned with what we ultimately want to achieve.
Or we're going to lock in 50 years of high carbon production.
Yeah. Right.
We can go down a huge rabbit hole about, is lithium going to be here for the next 20 or 30 years, or do we have to redefine transportation?
That's the other significant challenge in doing any forecasting now, because of innovation and how it changes the dependency on different commodities. We now have sodium batteries. Yep. Even with copper, we have so much going on in terms of innovation that, I think Goldman Sachs are suggesting by 2040 we will have 60 million tons of copper demand. There's a paper out by BMO that just suggests that there may be 20 million tons of copper destruction in the demand forecast because of innovation. Becoming much smarter about how we use copper, room temperature or liquid nitrogen temperature, superconductivity, a whole bunch of other stuff. People going away from copper altogether and using other metals, aluminum. And so it is a very uncertain world out there. And in that environment, mining companies have to make investments based on assumptions around pricing, demand, because it's a commodity market. We're saying, can we reduce some of that uncertainty so that you can focus on the things that's really important, when you bring those mines to life? And I just want to add another thing as well. What Michael said is that these certificates don't last forever, and they may have declining subsidies because we want to incent you to actually do the learning that's required. Yeah. If you don't do any learning, we won't do what Tesla is doing in catalyzing. Every year they get better, get cheaper as they learn more. That's how they can now look at the Tesla 2 model, because they built the Roadster, which is super expensive, and then they learned. And so miners will say, but we're going to be building a mine and it's going to last for 40 years, and you're going to pull the rock from under us in 5 years, and then what if we haven't learned fast enough? But it's, again, going back to, who said you have to build a big mine that lasts 40 years? Who said you cannot build a mine that has a 5-year life on a small ore body, so that in that 5 years you exhaust the minerals and go down the learning curve, and then the mine production and the credits terminate at the same time. And then the next mine that you're starting to plan now already with the intention that it's going to be a lower cost, you can sign parallel contracts and get going on that. And so it's a staggered approach. We have to get away from the orthodoxies we use in thinking about mining when we want to leverage the capacity of this new market mechanism to really accelerate us to doing something differently. And it's fantastically exciting, I think, for miners because, my son, 8 years old, I have to take him away from the computer because he wants to play Minecraft. Kids like this. I think the mining industry will draw lots of people to it if it can unlock this level of innovation that people will be attracted to. Yeah. And there's lots to be done. The world is going to be dependent on this. If mining do not succeed, we do not succeed. Yeah. And so it's very exciting. We just have to create the right milieu and the right mechanisms, and then create the right context and get going.
It comes. What you just said, Adriaan, comes back to the conversation we had 10 years ago about modular mining.
Exactly.
Assets, you're done in 5 years, right? Versus planning for 20 or 30 or 40. And the discussion we had in 2018 in Calgary at the Deloitte office is the what do you call it? World-class asset is not a contiguous asset. Right. That's
dependent on the lens you look at it, right? And if you look at a lens with certain constraints, many of those ore bodies that you used to, or the kind of ore bodies that you were looking for that fit the constraints of the lens are not available anymore. So suddenly you say, it's really hard to bring a mine to market now. None of them have financial feasibility. Yeah. It's like you're looking at the wrong lens. It's hard to change the lens because that involves risk. But what if you can attach the environmental attributes that somebody's willing to pay for, and then also help you then pay for the risk of doing things differently.
And break those constraints.
It's right, and then bundle it all together and have a go at it.
Yeah. So a lot of talk around like all of this is really cool, and the idea of the VCPPs, virtual commodity
purchase agreements.
Agreement. VCPA. Sorry, I had an extra P. So the two of you have been, and I'm assuming others have been working on this model for probably a while, several months, years, whatever. Where is it now? Like, have you talked to mining companies? Have you talked to suppliers? Are you pushing it internally? Where is it, and where do you think it needs to go to get this actually moving?
So we've just now, I think, gotten to the point that I'm sufficiently confident that we just tied our shoelaces on the technical features of this thing. So we can run the numbers, we can do the matrix algebra, we're appropriately applying, we understand where emission factors, how they're calculated, what the it's been about not quite a year and a half, but it's been 14, 16 months of making sure that it all tucks and ties. In parallel with that, along the way, we've been sort of beating the bushes, talking to anybody foolish enough to listen to us about what we have in mind. And that has progressed, I'm happy to say, to the point that we're having, I'd say, conversation zero, right, with a couple of different mining companies.
Awesome.
And we've had some very positive responses from what I'll call the demand side of the equation. So consumer products companies, pharmaceutical organizations, others, where they are making net zero commitments, and then when they look under the hood and realize, oh crap,
there's a discovery process.
That's what that means. And they've been, I'm happy to say, very complimentary around the insight that the uncovering the upstream commodities they rely upon. So we were involved in some conversations with a pharmaceutical company, and we said, over 6% of your scope 3 footprint, and 6%, just to put that in context, that's a really big number. That's in the top 10 of commodities, right? Because scope 3 is
makes up your...
That makes up your scope 3. Scope 3 is a long tail problem, not a Pareto problem, right? So it's not like there's 5 or 6 things that are 80% of your scope 3. Right? Most organizations are looking at 150, 200 different commodities, right? So 6% is a big number. That's in the top 10. And we said 6% of your scope 3 footprint comes from grain farming. And they said, but we don't buy any grain. I'm like, yeah, I know. That's why this is a helpful lens, right? Because it shows you the upstream commodities that really matter, right? That are really rolling up to become your scope 3 problem. Because if you look at your scope 3 problem in terms of what you actually buy, it's sitting in things like legal services. and law firms are 94% scope 3. So how are you supposed to fix that problem? So some conversation on the demand side, some conversations on the supply side. The last piece of that puzzle is the standard setters in the
Well, before that, I mean, we're also having now the demand side and the supply side. We're sort of facilitating conversations between them, because the supply side says, yeah, that sounds really an interesting mechanism, and we'd like to sign up, but what if there's no buyers on the other side?
Yeah.
And the buy side says, yeah, we'd like that. It fits our strategy.
What's
but
it going to cost?
Are there any mines willing to do that, and what's the premium we have to pay?
Yeah.
And so we're sort of the facilitators in the middle, and now actually in the wormhole, we now have both sides of the equation starting to have preliminary conversations. And I would say that this itself is an innovation as well. What we're proposing is a market innovation, and we're at probably TRL 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And so, all the bench work has been done. Now it's getting to have a prototype, a transaction to be done.
Yeah.
And then, but because it's not constrained with physical requirements, it's something that can rapidly transition through to TRL 9, because we're not relying on having to go build stuff to do stuff physically. It's all digital, it's contracting, it's getting the right parties involved, it's organization.
No, we have to figure out something harder, which is how to get people to change their minds.
Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion.
I got the wrong degree
That's the
for
wall
that
in front
one.
of us in the TRL somewhere.
And and part of that is conversations with the standard setters in the voluntary market.
Yeah.
Right. So you think about things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, in particular, Bureau Gold Standard, other places that in good faith, right, want to provide guidance for organizations so that when those organizations follow those rules, they achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, right? So back to the topic, and I don't speak for them, but I think in good faith they are looking for ways to create actionable guidance, right? I don't think they're necessarily hung up on making sure that it's right to the 7th decimal place if that compromises effectiveness. And the good news there. Talking with some folks in that space as well. So I think there is language in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. They've introduced this concept of supply sheds, for example, as a way to begin to break the connection between decarbonizing a particular upstream commodity and actually consuming that commodity and taking credit for that decarbonization, right? So they understand that supply chains are enormously complex and very often, as a consequence, quite opaque. And so they can't say, in every single instance, if you're a food processor and you have lower carbon beef, but you can't track the specific animals that end up in your products, they're saying, well, if we insist on that, we're going to undermine effective action. So no, we want to relax those constraints. So I think there's room for the kind of thing that I'm describing. There's an organization called the Advanced Indirect Mitigation Platform, aimplatform.org, I think. And they're working on something quite similar, right? But again, in a slightly more aggressive way, saying that as you look at exactly this space, frankly, as you look at the hard-to-abate commodities and you look at the complexity and the opacity of the supply chains, and you look at all of the constraints that we've looked at, right? It's not like we've discovered something that nobody else noticed.
Yeah.
We're trying to put our oar in the water and help move the boat forward. So there's reason to think, I'll call them green shoots, in all three of those domains, right? Supply side, demand side, standard setting bodies, and that's enough to keep us positive.
Get started.
Yeah, because we keep working on this.
So if
I wasn't referring to undersea mining with ore in the water, just to clarify.
I'm not even going there. We have to fix what's on the surface of the earth first. So, Adriaan, you said TRL 3, but it can move pretty quickly. Michael, you've had discussions with companies on both ends just to make sure you've got the two of them, right? They have to be connected or it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. When do you think you're going to get this? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, what did we say? What did we say about not being able to predict stuff? I'm not even gonna guess.
It's hope. If you're trying to push this, are you trying to get something done by like this year, next year? When would you like to see the first?
Well, last year is when I'd like to see it, but I don't know. I would guess that if 2 years from now, if we haven't pulled it off, then it may be beyond us.
Yeah.
I would continue to believe it's a great idea, but maybe it's just not one that I'm able to put in the end zone.
I think we can't be driving by ourselves. It has to be a collaborative effort. I think the
Show
latent
the
demand
pathway.
is there.
Yeah.
I think if you look at what Apple has tried to do with Elise's by going upstream and saying, I want to be able to say to my customers of iPhones that you will have true zero aluminum.
Yeah.
So it didn't use this mechanism, but it's the same principle. There was a latent need on the companies selling products to direct consumers to be able to have that value proposition and live it. And then they went to the Quebec government and Rio Tinto and Alcoa, and they created an electrode that doesn't emit any carbon, right? Only oxygen with nickel inside of it. And so what they got from it is not just, hey, like we have a decarbonized supply chain now, we won't have to pay any credits. They see that as their responsibility as a very large and the most valuable company in the world to lead, just like Tesla, right? And so they're doing these things. But it's very hard for other companies to do the same thing. They may not have the balance sheet that
some of these
that Apple
organizations are categories of one, right?
Yeah.
And I was talking to someone in the space who said, well, for any of these kind of inset purchase agreement stuff, you'll always be able to get the dilettantes. Their word, not mine. And it's that's a somewhat, I hope that's an unnecessarily cynical view. My belief, right? I'm just asserting this, right, in the absence of evidence. But my belief is that the mechanism we're describing is sufficiently concrete, sufficiently specific, sufficiently tied to all of these other elements that it provides a level of visibility and a type of realizable value that will be able to get past the dabblers, right? That we will be able to, and if we can mobilize enough, combine it with the anchor tenants, there's a lot of things that have to knit together. But that's how disruptive innovations have always worked, right? You've created a parallel system. Yeah. And so when people see a system, understandably, they say, but that's a lot of things. Like, yeah, it is, but it's small, so it's okay, right? It is a parallel small system, right? The folks who made mini computers were making far fewer, far smaller, far less expensive computers than mainframes and laptops and. And all of those things became disruptive innovations. Unfortunately, they were all commercialized by completely new organizations. Yeah. So we know how to do this. It's just that incumbent companies, to as they say in the stand-up comedy business, a callback to Adriaan's earlier observation about Keynes. It's not, we don't need new ideas. We need to escape the old ones. Yeah. And so that's the challenge.
So in terms of levers to pull to actually push more companies, for example, to be involved. Adriaan, you mentioned ESG a couple of times, right? And that's evolving as well. What about the financial institutions, the investment institutions like the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, who are looking at mining companies going, you've got to do something here. Are you trying to push or pull in that lever as well?
I mean, maybe you can talk about the New York mining investment.
Oh yeah, well the short answer is not yet. Yeah. I've got to think. So I made an assertion a little while ago about the idea that if we can give you a line of sight to revenue, then the capital will show up. Yeah. And so my hope is we will soon enough be in a position to test that hypothesis. Yeah. Right. And so on the investment side, the empirical claim is that investors will see in these advanced purchase agreements a credible source of revenue that they will be prepared to back with investment capital. Mm-hmm.
That aligns with their ESG requirements as well. So they're struggling right now to invest in the mines and comply with their ESG requirements that they promise to their boards and the boards promise to their shareholders. And so I think once you can show that it is possible to do that and provide the kind of shareholder returns, the fair returns that your investors require, and have these other attributes on top of that for these kinds of investments. And I think there's another feedback loop that will evolve from this. As the technologies that reach TRL 8 are now being invested in, which is, I think, what CIMIC has always, I think when I met you however many decades ago, I mean, the intent was of CIMIC to say, how do we accelerate these technologies into the market? So how do we actually solve the big problems of mining, and how do we connect it to the innovators so that it can actually get accelerated and adopted, right? I think as soon as it becomes known that if you show up with the right technology that satisfy the requirement for the mine, across these dimensions, that the indirect customers are willing to fund because it's valuable for them, because it's valuable for our sustained survival, that can scale, and that there will be different tranches of financing available to do that. I think it will spur innovation on the VC side, and bringing people to the mining industry to say, I want to participate in that because, first of all, I understand how important mining is. I have technologies that relate to the hard-to-abate sector. I have skills that I would bring to the mining industry. And I know that if I actually reach a certain TRL level, that what previously was the valley of death, when you have your technology, but then you can't get any of the customers to adopt it because of the cost issue. Well, that issue doesn't exist anymore. So suddenly you oiled the wheels of innovation, even upstream, where people have conceptual ideas that will now be able to release more capital because they understand that as long as you reach a certain threshold, we don't get stuck with the commercial readiness assessment then, where you now have all these great technologies which have low technology risk, but can't be scaled because of the cost factors that are still too high. So I think it's a straw that breaks the camel's back sort of thing. As soon as you can unlock the flow of the right capital between willing participants, I think it will unlock innovation on the demand side, where more people start to say, wow, how can we actually ask our customers to create different types of demand consortiums? Because there's a mechanism to channel that funds now. And when people far upstream see, I want to go innovate in mining because I know if I reach this TRL level, there's going to be scaling funding available. And yes, you have to compete with others, which makes it a vibrant environment. I think it's, you have to start somewhere, and I think then as we evolve, this thing will scale on its own.
It's interesting. You hit on two things. One, like you talked about CMIC getting the technologies there quickly, but it wasn't. We did what, and are continuing to do what you guys are doing now, is how you do it. It's not the what, it's the how. Like the whole concept of co-developing technology, the industry's never heard of it. They've never used it.
Right, and that's the lower risk as well, right? Instead of one company taking all the risk, let's share that. We're saying, well, that brings the technology risk down, but you're still stuck with the commercial risk. Okay, well, we'll bring something in to lower that risk as well from far away non-consuming customers. And so if you bundle this all together, suddenly the system seems like it's got momentum.
And that's what we're in the process of doing now, because the discussions we're having with investors through our subsidiary, Rethink Mining Ventures, is showing that the VCs and others in Silicon Valley are now going, what's this mining thing? We should take a look at the mining technology for all sorts of reasons. Like even Google, one of the head of circular economy for Google, has made statements to that effect as well. Mm-hmm. So that is happening. We're trying to bring a few of these things together.
They're just now more aware, but they're still stuck.
We're trying to unstick it. We're trying to unstick it. Right. It's interesting conversations, and we're seeing it actually moving fairly quickly. Yeah. We're a little surprised by this. But I want to go back to the ESG thing, the ESG and the investment side, as a lever to pull, like to push, to force. So what we're hearing from a number of investors, that mining companies in general, this is across the board, and there's ones on each end, is that there's greenwashing with respect to ESG. That's got to change, right? It's a tech tick box. One investor we spoke to basically said, you've got the two bookends. You've got one that says, we're all over this, 100% committed, and they're doing it. The other bookend is, don't even put that on paper. I don't want to hear it, right? ESG. It's really amazing the sort of things we've heard. So what we're seeing from the investors on the ESG lens, and maybe this sort of lens could be used for what you're doing, is that they want visibility into what the mining companies are investing in and how they're decarbonizing on the technology, the processes, the business models, everything. So they're looking for that. And we've got them joining us to have that visibility. So when I said lever, like to actually pull that lever, going through the investment side to actually push the mining companies to say, that's only in the mining side. Mm-hmm. It's not the downstream side. It may be worth taking a look at that as a bit of a lever. Again, I'm not sure.
Listen, they eventually have to be able to validate, of course, that, which technology will they be willing to pay a premium on. Yeah. And there has to be somebody arbitraging between different technologies. Engineering firms will have to be involved. That's still to sort of be figured out. Yeah. I mean, there are companies like Sigma Lithium, I think in Argentina, that has brought very, very low carbon lithium to the market by just being smart about doing things differently, right? So it's possible. It's possible with today's technology, but we want to make it easier to scale faster.
Yeah.
And so I think that visibility is useful. But if all you see the problem more clearly, but no solution to move on from that, it just makes you more depressed, and it doesn't actually move the ball forward. And what we need to do now is to move the ball forward. And by definition, these new technologies, the new hydrogens, if it was already competitively advantaged or cost competitive, it would have been adopted if it had the environmental attributes. But the reality is it doesn't. And it will take some years to get there, right? And some will never get there, and they will fall off, just like normal innovation happens. There will be lots of tryouts, and the tree will be pruned. But the problem is, who pays the price of that pruning and new buds forming and the growth of the forest? We have people on the other side. We have 100 trillion global economy, and then we have a 1% size mining industry that has to support that whole economy. There is money available, and there's risk to be taken. Right now, that risk is falling on VCs, but then VCs get to do the technology risk and then have no commercial adoption. And then you'll have the governments coming in with the IRA, for instance, and saying, we will subsidize that. But governments don't want to subsidize 1,000 different things because they can't manage the administration of that. So essentially it goes to a few very large companies, large subsidies, and there's no requirement for you to prove. It's just, you're convincing us that we need to make the subsidy in order to drive the price down, but there's no metrics that holds you accountable, really. This one is where the customers hold you accountable in that if you do not deliver it, we'll make you the promise of paying, not up front, but after the fact.
Here's a shock. You don't get paid till you deliver value. Everyone okay with that?
Right. So I think in that way it hedges the risks on both sides. It drives the right behavior. It removes that challenge of. So the other thing as well is if you think about the demand versus the cost, right? So supply and demand from a commodity perspective, and then the premiums that people are trying to envision would be there that will justify this investment. But if you look at potential demand destruction, like we talked about from copper, for instance, what that means is if you're trying to build a copper mine at lowest cost just to be in the supply side, but that this demand side gets destroyed, you may not be able to continue to sell because the volume in the demand side won't be there. And but if you're a green copper mine, then I would argue that the last mines that would be closed down would be those ones that has the lowest ESG impact and the lowest carbon footprint and is subsidized in order to get that. They will be the ones that survive. We're going to need copper. You want to be on the side of the equation where these would be the mines that's not just on the lowest cost curve, but they're on the highest environmental ESG attribute that people will. They're not going to close down a mine that has all the wrong attributes just because it's lower cost. When cost doesn't matter anymore, it's all about the attributes. So I think there's a lot of things for companies to look at this and say, wow, that insulate me from a lot of strategic risk that otherwise I would have to assume if I go ahead and just trying to be the lowest cost. Because if the demand disappears, how do I guarantee that I'll still be the preferred supplier? Yeah, I think by adding these attributes that we know are going to be required going forward. Nobody's going to say, by 2040, it's okay, we can go and emit the way we used to before. It seems to be a hard target that we should get to net zero. That's an immovable target for all of us to collectively reach. So,
exactly. So, what do you call this? You have a name for this?
Yeah, well,
temporary. Otherwise,
exactly. It's by dint of repetition, it may just become what we call it. But a long time ago, coined the title, the label, demand better. Yeah. Right, so demand better of ourselves, demand better of our suppliers, demand better of our customers, and organize our demand for these things in a way that we can demand better the inputs that we require in ways that create, ultimately, one hopes, a sustainable future.
It's better to start with the demand to pull
Yes,
the mining company
absolutely.
along, so that we can demand better of ourselves.
Well, it's like if you want to affect change, sometimes you need the baseball bat, whether it's legislation or something else forcing the change. That's typically how
Just
it
hold
works.
ourselves to a higher standard.
Yeah.
So demand better.
Now that being said, though, I do, in defense of the mining industry, I do see that they are changing. Like since I started CMIC, 10 years ago, like the in terms of innovation, in terms of looking at things differently, looking at clients differently, looking at stakeholders, government, et cetera, that is changing. This seeing ourselves better. And
Well, where did we
behaving
start the
differently.
conversation, right? Which is that the reason the disruption is not happening is because there are no customers.
Yeah.
That's willing to pay.
Yeah, I mean,
It's willing
the
to pay for
attributes
that.
that's the market failure.
Yeah.
The market failure, it's not an externality problem.
Yeah.
Right? There are customers willing to pay to compensate for the externality.
Yeah.
It's just there's no way for them to actually do it.
To do
access
exactly,
those
and this
customers.
solves that market problem.
Well, we hope. I'd like to
hope.
find out if it
Yeah.
solves that problem. I've got a hypothesis.
Well, based on what I've heard, I think it makes a lot of sense. Right? That's why we had you here today. Even though, like, there's a lot of depth behind this stuff. Some of the readings you'd passed over, Michael, is it takes a while to unpack some of that. But specifically, is there anything we can do at Rethink Mining Ventures to help you out?
I think what we're doing now is creating awareness that I think people also first have to recognize that this market failure that Michael explains, that exists. Sometimes you're laboring in a paradigm and have sort of paradigm blindness. You don't even know that you're stuck with this problem because you're focusing on something so hard in some other space. So to being aware that there's this problem, and then being aware that there are solutions, actually, I think opens themselves up for inviting new ideas. And I think the whole point of this is also, it's not like the whole mining industry would go to a conference and now everybody's going to sign up to credits, right?
No.
We don't need 100 mines to do the same adoption of hydrogen to get the price curve to go down, right? And so there won't also initially be that much credit. So there's going to be some competition for the smaller price subsidies that are available, and that's a good thing, because what we'd like to do is to get the mining companies to recognize that this provides them the potential to chart a path to be competitive in exactly the way that will allow them to sustain value creation for their shareholders, the community, the environment for much longer, with the help of society that's actually asking them to change, but not helping to provide the means, right? And so I think for them to recognize that there's such a vehicle, and talk to us and talk to their boards and say, are we willing to do that? And I think we're also working with the supplier side of the equation, because the mining companies themselves are not necessarily the creators of the innovation that they need to adopt in order to use it, right? So it's the upstream suppliers that needs to become part of the equation, and for us to have conversations with them. And so we've had conversations with a company that's made a zero-emission truck that listened to this and said, my mining client wants to adopt our technology, but are stuck on the premium that they need to do this. And so the innovator came to us and said, can we broker a conversation with the mining company to say that, there's maybe a way to get this funded? And so I think it's multiple conversations in parallel. Michael will be publishing more stuff on the detail. So I think...
Well, what's different if you take a look at this, compare it to an entrepreneur with a new thing they're trying to sell, widget, whatever else. What you have that's different is you're not coming into the mining industry not understanding who they are. You're not coming into the downstream markets not understanding who they are. You've got like 20 plus 33 years experience, whatever it is. So it's a little different. So when I say, and you said, Adriaan, TRL 3 to 8, we can do it quickly based on your experience, and you've got Deloitte.
Well, the nature of the work as well,
and the nature of the work,
build a mine to
and
test
the
it.
externalities in terms of net zero, and we've got to change something in general. If you don't have this up and running in 2 years, You should have it running next year.
Yeah, well, sooner maybe. Like it requires the ecosystem also to come together to listen at the same time. And so we're trying to orchestrate something like that here in Canada. Bring the mining suppliers, mining companies, and bring the government.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at Canada supplying critical strategic minerals to the world, as a good governance body. But because of our governance, there's a paradox here. We're so good at governance and so good at social and environmental that it causes us to be uncompetitive. It takes 17 years to bring a new mine online. Well, the transition will be halfway through before we actually open up. We'll open up the first mines, and then we'll open them up because we've locked all the because of the regulation. We would have had to lock in operational plans early on to get the permitting to align to those plans. So that doesn't work. So here is a chance, I think, for Canada to say we have the minerals. We actually want to break the trade-off of being socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and getting to the market fast. Yeah. Okay, that seems to be a trade-off that we can't break. You can break it if you remove the bottleneck that's causing people to design the mines in the same way, which is this market mechanism.
And one of the things you talk about is that, Canada can be a producer, but it's a small consumer.
Yes,
so that's a problem.
Get more consumers.
Except it's not a problem anymore, because we're going to give you consumers for the environmental attributes of these small, low-carbon mines producing critical minerals in an environmentally responsible way, getting a price premium, or rather getting the environmental attributes paid for without having to command a premium for the commodity itself, right? And so you could even imagine taking the final step in that equation and saying, well, Canada has a carbon tax on consumers.
Yeah.
And say, well, you know what? Corporate Canada, you've got a tax liability as a result of your carbon footprint. I'll let you discharge that tax liability if you buy price guarantees for the environmental attributes of the commodities that are produced at the low carbon mines.
VPPAs.
It all knits together.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yes, it's a system, but it's not a system that needs to operate at global scale right out of the gate.
No, absolutely.
It's a system that has to operate, and this is absolute truth. It has to operate at the scale of one project.
Yeah.
We put together enough consolidated demand to support one at-scale prototype for one mineral on one location, and that's enough to demonstrate an existence proof that this parallel system works. Yeah. That's not an insurmountable barrier, in my view.
And the challenge with permitting and social and environmental responsibility is somewhat related, again, to the nature of the mine that you're building. By dramatically changing the mine planning, using different technologies, you're not circumventing regulation. You're eliminating some of it.
Well,
if you have to look at fossil fuel contamination, and you have to have a permit of handling fossil fuels, but there's no fossil fuels in the mine, you do not have a permit requirement for that. And so, if you can involve the community from an equity perspective as part of the development of the plan, because you've changed the way you do things, and become community owners as well. You can accelerate it and improve the governance of all of it and deliver the mines that the world really need and be the leaders in that. So like Tesla has led the automotive, why can't Canada lead the transformation in mining in the way the world needs mining to be?
And we're back to where we started around embracing and breaking constraints. You start out by embracing the constraints that confine you. And but in a way that it puts you on the path to ultimately breaking them. So you go back to electric cars. Now you've got electric cars that are cost competitive, that are more fun to drive, that are connected automobiles, that have reinvented the automobile experience, that have zero tailpipe emissions, that on and on and on. Now they're just better in every way. Yeah, they're just better. Yeah. Well, I want to give you a cobalt mine that's better in every way. Yeah. But nobody's smart enough to build one right out of the box. So what we're describing is a process that allows you to get there.
Yeah. And just back to your comment about government and regulations and eliminating stuff that's going to be in the regulations, et cetera. Crazy idea. Is there any way to tie this demand better to regulations? It's a dangerous thing to do because governments don't really understand these things.
Yeah, tie to regulation. Don't know. I'm going to put that in the bucket of hard problem solve later.
Yeah, absolutely. No, agree.
Maybe not to force it, but to have the initial suggestion from government to say, listen, we're not going to sign up front, but you come with the evidence, and we may consider, looking at those inset credits or the virtual commodity purchase power agreements as an I want to use the offset word, but as an offset to your carbon scope 3 emissions.
Yeah.
We'll stand by now that we understand it, and we'll reserve the right to. So from a regulatory perspective,
you get a tax credit.
You get a tax credit for that, right? Yeah. But I don't think forcing, as in you have to do this.
No. Touch on.
I mean, government does that all the time. They have research tax credit, they have tax credit for all kinds of behaviors that they want to motivate.
Yeah.
And you could imagine a situation where and it's not something that has to lie entirely out of their hands, by the way.
Yeah.
Right. So the permitting process for the mines and all that goes with it could say, look, in order to qualify for the appropriate tax credit, the mine has to meet. Fair enough.
Yeah.
All that's fine. I mean, I think we can start in the voluntary market in the way that we're describing, and then how it evolves from there. Well, I'm not smart enough to figure all that out. I barely know what I'm going to have for breakfast tomorrow. So, but I think everything I've learned in my work in strategy and innovation would tell me that this puts us down a particular ski run that gets us where we want to go.
Yeah.
Precisely what path we follow,
you'll see
once. Yeah, it depends on,
It's a foothold market that sits outside of the current market path.
Set of constraints.
Yeah.
And that
set
takes
of
you to a different
constraints.
place.
And you cannot get to that unless you have this thing that plugs the hole from an economic perspective. That says we're going to have to connect the indirect consumers that has the money with the people that have the solution.
The ability and the willingness to pay.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the reason I was asking about governance is because next week I'm actually sitting on a panel at the Energy Mines Ministers Conference about deployment of clean tech. And
Have them give me a call.
Yeah. Well, there's the Minister Wilkinson's going to be there.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's always a push conversation.
Yeah.
We got the technology here. They're trying to push into the market. There's resistance from the buyer. Why? Because they don't have the ability to pay. Why? Because their customers don't have the ability to pay a premium. So then they're pushing back to the suppliers, invest more, drive the cost down. Instead of saying, go to the market early, and then we'll learn using customers' funding versus using investors' money to stay out of the market until you're cheap enough. Well, that's not going to work for us.
It always confuses me because this is well known that there's a difference between a learning curve and a scale curve, right? And when technologies are young, you worry about learning curve effects long before you worry about scale curve effects. Yeah. And yet, we're looking at technology saying, we have to fix the cost problem. I know, do it at scale.
Right.
I'm just going to skip over the teenage years.
Yeah.
No, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
Right? You need to go through that learning curve to earn the right to get on the scale. Once you're on the scale curve, the problem's been solved.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem, the word adoption in first scale. Yes. We got the technology, now need to scale it. Yeah, but it's not ready yet. Well, if we scale it, then it will get ready by itself. No, it won't, because you're scaling it in the environment where people are not going to expect to be learning. They're going to expect to.
What did they say? No matter how many people you put on the job, it takes 9 months to make a baby.
Yeah.
This stuff needs to go. We can't hurry it up. All the more reason why we have to start now.
Yeah.
I've seen too many net zero plans where companies say, we're going to deal with our scope 1 and scope 2, and come 2035, the only thing left will be the hard problems. Mackerel.
Oh wow!
Boy, did you miss the memo?
Yeah,
we got to make it the easy to buy the sectors because the funding is available, and change the words that we're using, because the hard part is not in the technology or the innovation. It is the market failure related to the economics of how this works, and that we can fix because it's not bound to physics.
You just have to demand better.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. I didn't have any. Did you gentlemen have any other closing things? We've covered a lot of stuff. We could go down lots of rabbit holes, but
no, it's fine.
I think it's very good. I mean, it's exciting. It's necessary. I think one also have to contemplate, if this doesn't succeed, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Like, what else you got up your sleeve?
What else do we have? I don't see anything else. I mean, we have all the elements in place. We just can't catalyze it. We need activation energy.
Yeah.
We know where the lower minimum is, but there's this hump that sits in front of us to get there. And this hump is not the people, not the will, not the technology. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but they're small humps. The big hump is the fitting in the capitalist system, which requires you to be competitively price competitive in the commodity markets, which you can't solve magically just pushing against the rope. You got to have a different mechanism, and if it's not this one, it has to be something similar. Yeah. Because if we don't remove that activation energy needed to get to the other side, we won't get to the other side. If we don't get to the other side,
and the political will is not there to insist on it by fiat.
No,
right?
No,
like absent, do it.
Yeah.
It won't happen.
And carbon tax would be a solution for that, but that is so complicated, and
and even then, it doesn't fit, because a carbon tax is two things. That a carbon tax, I don't think, will be effective enough, because it just increases the cost of doing business.
Right, it's just a passed on cost now. Now everything is more expensive, but it doesn't differentially.
It doesn't create the incentive to actually
to do what we need to do. Yeah.
And it wouldn't until it was so high that you would cripple the ability to do it.
Yeah.
So there's a catch-22 there.
And that will take long, because there will be so much resistance on the way there. It wouldn't happen.
There already is resistance.
Yeah. This is a voluntary market. It doesn't have to be the whole market. It has to be a pocket of
it has
voluntary
to be big
customers.
enough to support one project.
Yeah.
And one project, by the way, that is about 15% the size of all the way mines currently think about one project.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be 500,000 tons a year with a 40-year time horizon. It has to be 10,000 tons a year for 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do that. And if you're like, but wait a minute, it's 3 times the price. That's okay. I think I can fix that problem.
Yeah.
Because if you come up, I mean, the carbon intensity of something like copper is so incredibly high that if you reduce it by 90%, the number of tons I get to sell at $300 a ton.
Yeah.
If I got to find you $20,000 a ton for copper instead of 10, I think I can do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But empirical claim.
Yeah.
We got to go find out.
Got to go prove it.
Our kids are demanding it of us. We should demand it of ourselves, and we should do it.
Absolutely.
Except I had to stop talking about it at the dinner table, because my kids said, "You're depressing the hell out of me. Shut up." And I said, "You know what? You got a point. Not making me feel any better either." So.
I think it's only depressing if we can't see ourselves clear of adopting something like this. Yeah. I think it's, for the first time, we now look at mining and what is possible. And we can see this in the excitement of mining companies that we're talking to.
Yeah.
That they realize there's something there, and that if this can provide them the air cover, if you like, to go and do the things that they're struggling to do but want to do anyway, this is removing an obstacle, a constraint that they will be very happy to do.
It actually removes a couple of constraints and addresses a couple of their challenges on the technology side, and how do we do things better, but also on the demand side, how do we get a price premium for what we're trying to sell.
And every mining company doesn't have to sign up to Michael's point. I mean, there's going to be the innovators that will be the leaders that show the way, and others will follow.
Yeah.
We can't have everybody be in the top quartile. It doesn't work like that, right?
Well, it's similar to the aviation fuel. You've got a small group of people who believe in it, the snowball effect, right? Mm-hmm. And it grows. And the people that join are because it's 2 reasons. We really believe in it, or we don't want to be left behind. We want to see what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? That's how it works. So you can get one to start.
And it will solve the supply concern as well, I think, from suppliers, because it will draw more people to the mining industry, more capital, more mines will be opening up. Different ore bodies will become in play that's not in play now because of, those ore bodies don't fit the lanes that we used to look at it. Well, if you can change the lanes and have a couple of lanes, suddenly supply is not such a big issue. You just have to have somebody fund it.
Or Adriaan changed the lens by getting new people from outside of mining start a mine.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go. Simple answer.
My 8-year-old showed me the other day how he built a roller coaster going into a cavity that he built that looked like a mine, and he was very excited. He said, "Look, he did it in a few minutes. If you ask somebody to go and develop a mine plan that had different technology going in there, it'll take 6 months, and people convince themselves not to start because it's too hard."
Well, part of the thing too is changing the language. I'm not a mining person, Michael. I've worked in one mining company as a co-op student. That's it, for like 4 months, and that's it. But I've been working in the innovation space for decades, almost 3 decades in multiple industries. I don't like the term mine planning, because you're stuck into this sort of mindset and with the blinders on. What the industry needs to do, and this is the discussion I had with Alim from Hatch, is you've got to reframe. I don't want to say redefine, because you end up stuck, right? But reframe that conversation to what Andrew Reynolds talks about, right? Modeling and simulation. You don't want a mine plan, because plans will get you stuck on a rigid pathway. Modeling and simulation allows you that flexibility, especially when new technology comes along, ideas come along. You can actually plug it in and modify your plan, right? And then collect the data as it's operating.
Mining is very complex, and I have immense respect for people that are the miners and put these plans together.
Absolutely.
And the tools are now there. But again, I think the risk associated with doing things differently, they weren't willing parties to help fund that.
Yeah.
I think we can use our need to change on the ESG front as a way to help fund some of these other changes that needs to be made. And because we can do it in parallel, I think it's very important, what I've learned from Michael with disruption as well. You don't start the disruption process within the core.
Yeah.
Because the antibodies in the core is there to eliminate anything that looks different, because looking different is risk, and we don't want risk. Yeah. We've honed this solution over the last 50 years. You dare not change anything, so you'd have to take it outside of the core. So when we look at mining companies wanting to adopt that, I think they shouldn't see this as, wow, you're gonna create huge disruption inside of my tightly honed process. No. It's like, no, we're going to take a few of your select people and work and collaborate with others, do something on the side separately. It's just as we build a different mine, we fund it in a different way. We may also have to plan and support with the technologies that are available, do this completely differently as well. That's part of the thing that has to be learned and has to be funded in the absence of the constraints that we're used to making and the trade-offs that's in the orthodox and traditional mining.
And the only reason any organization will ever build a new system is if you give them a new customer.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The pull. You've got to have
a
pull.
So
he says, I'll give you the money. Can you build this for me? Yes. Go and do it over there.
Well, if you say to somebody, I need you to build something new, and then go find someone to buy it.
No, forget it.
I don't want that bad. No. And I don't blame anybody. That's the way the economy, that's why Clay's framework is so powerful, right? It lays bare an underlying truth. Yeah. So this is all about demand better, not supply better.
Yeah, demand.
It's called demand better. And so we'll give you a new customer that wants this very different thing. And the hope is that the industry will rise to the challenge.
Yeah, not the hope is. I'm pretty confident it will. And what you just described, Adriaan, sounded like Lockheed Martin.
Skunk Works. Yeah. Except they
never heard of it before.
Subsidized with a huge amount of taxpayers' money. We're trying to say the concept. Society is recognizing the need to change. They have the will. I mean, Deloitte did a survey in the US. I think they do that every year, sort of asking customers what would they be willing to pay for electricity if it's clean. Yeah. And I think, the majority of them said, we'll be willing to pay 30% more for our electricity if you could just guarantee us that it is greener and lower carbon emission. They want the industry to just get on with it. But the mechanisms are not that easy that you may demand that, but how do you support that? You can't just be talk either. When Greta Thunberg and those say, the people on the supply side and the regulation is just, that's true. But no, let's switch the owners on the consumers and say, listen, if you're willing to pay a little bit more for your products, if there's a mechanism that consume that collectively, the aggregate of that money finds its way to do the things upstream in the economy that we absolutely all understand we need to do, we can solve those problems so that they don't occur. Yeah. It's not just building decarbonized mines, it's building it so that the environmental impact and the environmental footprint and all the stuff we talked about, biodiversity, the community involvement, all of that stuff. You design that around, because when you bring in renewables and the decarbonized technology, you do it in a way that it sustains the economies around them as well, right? So it's not just for the mine anymore. It's how does the mine integrate into the community, into the environment? And all of that is part of decarbonizing by using the tools and the resources locally much more intelligently.
The interesting thing about what you're doing with Demand Better, it's all focused on net zero and decarbonization, but you could also probably, I'm assuming, apply to it to like zero tailings.
Well,
we want zero.
Yeah.
There's discussions going on now where we don't want tailings. Right. We want to eliminate tailings.
Right. So I think that's where regulation may come in and say you need to have a certain tailings footprint. But that's associated with then using, dry pressing or evaporating technologies or something like that. That's usually energy intensive. That currently is hugely carbon intensive. Yeah. So if you put regulation on that, then the onus is on the mines to say, wow, how are we going to be doing that cost competitively in Canada when the rest of the world don't have that restriction? Then you'd say, well, hey, looky here. That's a constraint that we can't relax. Yeah. But that's associated with energy, and energy is associated with carbon. Yeah. We have a mechanism for that. Yeah. Now you can use that to do all the things you want to do. So in some ways, there may be regulation that will allow you to do this This solution doesn't solve all the ESG problems. It solves the carbon problem because that's what we can quantify.
Yeah.
We can't quantify tailing in terms of how much tailings are in the tripod here, where we can quantify how much of the actual commodities there and what's the emissions associated with that. But that can be connected to the desirable outcome of all the other stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's a voluntary market. So you may go to your voluntary funders of subsidies and say, we can build a zero emission mine, but we're going to have a huge tailing pond. But if we reduce the tailing, we'll have to have 20% more energy, and that will push a subsidy up by another 20 or 30%. Yeah. Are you okay with that? And then for those voluntary customers, they say, we prefer that because it's a voluntary market.
Yeah.
And I think if the mechanism works,
and it's project specific. That's the other thing too, right?
And it has to be verified. And just like with the carbon, you show up with a zero emission copper, and your footprint in the tailings is that big, sorry, your premium is going to go down because it's sort of associated with that. You can bundle it maybe in that, I don't know.
You tie it together somehow.
But but that's tough to be resolved later. I think we have to focus on the stuff that's credible, it's quantifiable, measurable, and transactable.
Yeah.
If you like.
Cool.
So we start with carbon as a way to do all the other stuff eventually as well.
Awesome.
Ready.
We're almost at time, so
I'm going to run.
Otherwise, we're going to be talking here for another hour or so, and we can't be doing that. So this was awesome.
Was this on?
No, this is the rehearsal.
Start over.
It starts at noon. I know this is great. Thanks. Thank you for tuning in to Source. We hope you'll learn some valuable insights and really cool information about the mining industry, and especially how it impacts our lives every single day. You want to stay tuned to what we're up to and the really cool innovations that are going on every single day? Connect with us on our social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, or at our website, rethinkmining.org. Until next time, catch you later.